Thank you, Skip. And thank you all for coming. I want to pick up right where your dean left off, and with the idea of public service. As I say in my book, I think that if you don't know where a problem came from, you're not really going to be very persuasive if you try to persuade, if you're talking about how to solve it. So I think that it's pretty important to think about the history of the structures, the institutional structures that form higher ed. And if we look back at the history of higher education, let's do that briefly. This is a quotation from one of the founders of Princeton, and since you're reading it anyway, I'm going to read it to you. They say, you should never have more than 7 words on a PowerPoint slide because it's going to distract anybody who's from hearing you talk, but I'm going to read that slide. Though our great intention was to erect a seminary for educating ministers of the gospel, yet we hope it will be useful in other learned professions, ornaments of the state as well as the church. Therefore, we propose to make the plan of education as extensive as our circumstances will admit. Now, let's close read this. I'm an English professor. We close read. So if we close read this quotation, what we can see is that the mission of colleges, because that's what were being founded in the period of when Princeton was being founded, and really those are the kinds of institutions that characterized American higher education until the 1880s. Colleges were focused on producing students. That is, the goal of the college is to put educated students out into the world so that they can serve the state as well as the church. The reference to the church is because the earliest institutions of American higher ed, the oldest ones, were conceived of as training grounds for clergy. That's how Harvard was founded as a school for ministers. But 100 years later, when Princeton was being founded, already the founders were looking outside of the church and were seeing their students populating the secular professions and doing something useful out there. So that's the mission of the college. The mission of the college is to produce educated students. It is, in other words, a service mission. So we're beginning with the idea that higher education in this country originated as a public service mission in the most explicit terms. Now, after the Civil War, the American colleges had been proliferating, and up to that point, and they'd also been getting bigger. And after the Civil War, the United States became quite wealthy. The frontier was being opened, manufacturing was booming, and some American academics were going abroad. They were going to Europe to study because it was understood that you could be exposed to the finest minds and the most current research in Europe. So a lot of American professors would go off to Europe for a couple of years, and they would come back and they would speak rhapsodically about the European universities and how we need to build such a thing in the United States. And after the Civil War, the money was there for the first time. And so universities were founded in the period after the Civil War. And they were founded in all different kinds of ways. Some of them were grafted onto existing colleges. So, for example, Yale College became Yale University by adding graduate faculties. Some of them were founded from the ground up, like Johns Hopkins or the University of Chicago, about which more in a second. And others were founded by states, such as Arkansas, to which this school is connected. So you had a different bunch of different kinds of universities. But here is one statement of the ethos of the university. Whoops, sorry. It is proposed to establish not a college but a university. It is only the man who has made investigations who can teach others to investigate. Freedom from care, time for work, and liberty of thought are prime requisites in all such work. In other words, it is proposed in this institution to make the work of investigation primary, the work of giving instruction secondary. So this is William Rainey Harper, who was the first president of the University of Chicago, which was in the process of being founded with philanthropic money, most of it belonging to John D. Rockefeller. Let's close read this statement as well. And here, first of all, the important thing to note here is the word investigation. Investigation is research. That's the word that was being used at the time. And there are many ways in which this quotation is not too difficult. Harper is saying that research is more important than teaching. But if we compare that to Pemberton, erect a seminary for educating ministers of the gospel, yet we hope it will be useful in other professions. So Pemberton is elevating teaching. Harper is elevating investigation over teaching. So in the American higher education landscape, you have the values of the college, which are centered on teaching and service, and you have the values of the university, which are centered on investigation and the consequent production of knowledge. So if the college is, as I suggested, dedicated to producing students, the university dedicates itself to producing knowledge. Now, these don't have to be contradictory, but in the history of American higher education, they have grown up to be. That is, the professor's time. It's very important in professor world where I live to think of teaching and research as mutually sustaining activities that nourish each other. That by doing original research, I bring it back into the classroom and it makes my teaching more interesting, more energetic. By working as a committed teacher and committing myself to my students and their learning, I lead discussions that give me ideas that I then take into my research. So synergy, symbiosis, and I think that that's true. But I need for it to be true because that worldview underwrites all of American higher education and it's the only worldview that is compatible with the values of the college and the values of the university together. Now, I've talked about a kind of philosophical opposition that's built into American higher education, which is still a place where colleges and universities exist and sometimes even thrive together. But higher education is also a workplace. And as a workplace, there are a lot of things that go on in it, but one of those things that goes on is graduate school. And graduate school in the arts and sciences is, let's face it, most fundamentally a place where the faculty, it's the only place where the faculty can train the people who will be the faculty members of tomorrow. And certainly, most of the people who go to graduate school have that in their mind when they enter. And they're usually inspired to go to graduate school in the arts and sciences by the experience that they had with a teacher who they had as an undergraduate, typically. They've been inspired, in other words, by the teaching example. But let's talk about that workplace right now. The workplace, the graduate school workplace, imagine a cohort of graduate students. The first thing to note is that half of them are not even going to finish at all. 50% attrition, 5-0. It's an extraordinary figure. And it inspires no protest at all, partly because historically it used to be even higher. But it's also something that we've gotten used to and we've gotten complacent about, even though about half of that attrition ought to be unacceptable to us. Half of it takes place within the first couple of years. And that's okay, because specialized study in a discipline is not for everybody. And if you give people a year or two to figure it out, we ought to expect some people are going to say, okay, I thought this was worth it. But, you know, it's sort of like you say to yourself, you you eat a wintergreen candy and you think, hey, I like wintergreen. Then you buy yourself a whole bowl of wintergreen candy and you go home and you start eating one wintergreen candy after another, and after about 3 or 4, you're thinking, maybe I didn't like wintergreen as much as I thought. That's okay. You walk away, you say, okay, I want to try the other flavors. But about half the attrition is much later in programs, people who stay and they twist in the wind. That's awful. That's unacceptable. We shouldn't be living with it. But 50% attrition is something we have and we don't talk about. But let's talk about the other 50 who do finish. The 50% of people who start PhD studies and who finish the degree, remember that they went in inspired by teaching in order to get a professor's job. They come out, half of them won't get that. In other words, out of the 100 who start, 50 finish, and only 25 out of those 50 are going to get any kind of professorship at all. So that's pretty extraordinary. If we think about this, if we think about graduate school as a training ground for future professors, that only 1 out of 4 out of the people who enter it are actually going to get that professorship. That's not really very practical, and the human cost is something that we should not be ready to accept. If we train people, that's what it's about. But that isn't historically what it's about. For most of the history of American academia, people who have gone to get PhDs have done all kinds of work, not just professorships, but all different kinds of work. And yet, we tend not to be aware of that. But I want to get to that in a couple of moments. But what I want to say is that we are training people to want to be professors when the reality on the ground is, and almost without exception has been, that most of them won't be. So how can we defend an education that takes as long as it does, at least 7 years beyond the BA to get a PhD? That's in the sciences, which are the fast fields. In the humanities, it can be 9. If we have a time to degree that is that high, and that is unacceptable in its own way, then how can we condone this if we also say that we're preparing people to be professors when most of them aren't going to be? It's a case of disjunction. It's an entire course of study that does not correspond to the reality that the students face when they get out. And it's a reality that we, in the professoriate, we're aware of it. So why do we allow this? And part of the answer is we do it because we always have, which is an answer that you'll find in a lot of different walks of life. We've always done it this way. But in academia, you hear that answer, we've always done it this way, a little bit more often than you should. Certainly more often than ought to be acceptable to the population of graduate students whose lives we simply aren't treating very well. So we are teaching graduate students to want jobs that aren't out there for them. We are preparing graduate students for jobs that don't exist. And one of the arguments that I make in this book that I wrote is that fundamentally, this is a teaching problem. It's a problem that is rooted in the course of study that we design for graduate students and which we put them through. If we teach people to want something that isn't out there, that doesn't exist for them, that's on us. And we can't allow it to go on. But if we're going to prepare graduate students to want different kinds of things, if we're going to prepare them for lives outside of academia, for which they are abundantly qualified, graduate students in the arts and sciences emerge from PhD studies with a magnificent facility to manipulate, work with information, large bodies of complex information, in some really dexterous ways. They can analyze it, synthesize it, summarize it, they can teach it. They're really good at working with complex problems, at rendering them in terms that are audience appropriate, irrespective of what that audience may be, of who may be in that audience. They can adjust to it. It's a great skill set. In fact, one of the people who employs PhDs who I spoke to when I was researching for my book, he said, you know, he loved to hire PhDs. He said, they have this great skill set that somebody else already paid for. And he would hire them in at low middle management positions, and he would watch them skyrocket up the ranks. So why does the education that we give them not correspond to this reality? Well, this is something that I would like to discuss a little bit further, but I also want to bring up a question that I am often asked, which is how, if I'm a professor, how can I prepare students, my graduate students, how can I prepare them to look for jobs that are different from the one that I have? Because I'm a professor. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. It's the only thing I ever did. Except for 3 months flipping burgers when I was 17. Every job I've ever had has been pointed toward becoming a professor. How can I teach graduate students when I don't even know anything about this myself? And I have 3 answers to that question. One of them is simply this, that we professors, we have the job that we have because we're professional learners. We were the best student in the class a lot of the time. We wanted to please our teachers. We always colored within the lines. We were very conventional star students. We went on to jobs where we're professional learners. So go back to that hypothetical question. You asked me, how can I teach my graduate students something when I don't know it myself? Well, you're a professional learner. Go learn some things. This isn't the hardest thing you ever had to learn. The second answer to that question is this. You, as a professor, you teach introductory classes filled with undergraduates in your discipline. When you teach an introduction to sociology course, you know that the majority of those undergraduates in that course are not going to become professional sociologists. In fact, most of them aren't even going to major in sociology. And yet you can teach that course with the confidence that you're going to send those students out into the world with some of the basic principles of sociology, and you believe with reason, with the reason that comes with the commitment to the liberal arts, that the knowledge that they're gaining in that class is going to be useful to those students, even though they're going to go into different walks of life. And you can't do that for graduate students? Because your graduate classes have the same composition. Most of them, they may be all majors in sociology. They've gone on to graduate school in sociology, but the majority of them are not going to become professional sociologists. When you're teaching that graduate introduction to sociology, we already know half of them are not going to finish, and out of that half, only half of those are going to get professorships. In other words, 75% of that class are not going to become professional sociologists. And yet you can teach the class. You can teach these classes knowing that the students are not necessarily going to be professional sociologists, and you can teach them better if you know that. But there is a way that this is a bureaucratic problem. It's a policy problem. And the third answer that I'm offering to this hypothetical question is that graduate programs of all kinds need to forge organic early partnerships with offices of career services on campus. That if we invite specialists in graduate placement into graduate programs early as part of student orientation, we will teach graduate students that it is not shameful to want a job that is not a professor's job. Because we are role models not only in what we do, but in the desires that we teach. But there is a paradox. We have to use our status as role models to teach our students to have role models besides ourselves. It's a tough paradox because they come in wanting to be us. And it's fine to want to, I think, look at my students, it's fine to want to be me. I like being me. I think I have a great job. But I also know that when I was seeking this job, I knew that if it didn't work out for me, there were plenty of other things I was ready to do. And I need for my students to understand the same thing. But it's very difficult. And I'm going to bring this to a close by suggesting in some of the ways that this is very difficult. Because we're dealing with entrenched attitudes that have encoded themselves in the DNA of American academia. How many of you have ever heard of Google Engrams? Okay, let me explain what Google Engrams are, because this is teaching. So you've got the Google maintains a database of books. It's called Google Books. And if you want to read an old book, you can read it in entirety on the screen just by going to Google Books if the book is out of copyright, which most books in the history of publishing are. So Google maintains this database of millions of books, and it's a searchable database. And so if you ask Google to search that database for combinations of search terms, it'll tell you what percentage of the database you see the search term in. So what I'm about to show you is a picture of a search for two terms, research and professor. So Google is going to search the entire database of Google Books for sources in which the terms research and professor appear together. It's a blunt instrument, you'll agree, but it's nevertheless a telling instrument. And the results will be displayed in graph form over time. So you'll get to see what percentage of books from the 1800s had research and professor together, all the way up to the present. Here's the picture. So you can see, way over on the left, and I know some of you in the back, these numbers are a little low, way over on the left is 1800. And it goes all the way up to the present, past 2000. So you can see that for over 100 years, the percentage of sources in which research and professor appeared together is roughly constant. But you've got two jumps in the graph that are worth noting. Now, one of them is over here. First jump. That first jump in the 1920s corresponds to the time when foundation money first entered the world of American higher ed. The foundations started pumping money into universities because they realized they could outsource some of the research problems that they were trying to solve themselves, and the universities were eager to accept the money. The second jump, that's a huge exponential leap, and it corresponds to the Cold War. So the early days of the Cold War were a terrible time for professors in some ways that have been pretty well documented. The paranoid culture of the communist witch hunts in the 1950s, it was a terrible time for academia. Professors lost their jobs, they had to sign loyalty oaths, they were undergoing prurient scrutiny of their research of the sort that was really quite caricatured and was unfair. And it threw them into a defensive crouch. And there's a lot of great history that's been written about that. And if you're interested, I can refer you to some. But there was a time but the Cold War was also, in its way, a really great time for American higher ed because the money started to come from the government. The government invested in higher education as it never had before. It invested in higher education as the research and development lab for the Cold War, to try to combat the Soviets in the space race, the arms race, the technological race, all different kinds of races, got to keep up. So money started to come in because universities were used as the place to do the research to keep up. This happened, so the money entered the university at the same time that the university was also expanding demographically. So the GI Bill admitted legions of people who had never been to college before. Now, at around 1900, the percentage of people of college age who actually went to college was about 1%. That number has gone up and up and up, and today it hovers in the 50s. So the changes happened in accelerated fashion during the Cold War. First, the GI Bill, the National Defense Education Act in the wake of Sputnik, made it possible for other members of populations who could never before to think of college to go. The federally guaranteed student loan program during the 60s, even more. So the university was growing and becoming wealthy at the same time. And for that one generation, the Cold War generation of the 1950s and 60s, for that one generation, anybody who could finish a doctorate could get a professorship. but it was also the largest generation in the history of American academia, and it changed the idea of normal. So when we talk about how we've always done it this way in academia, we've always done it this way usually goes back to the 1950s or 60s, because that's when the academic workplace changed into what we have today. But really, what we're seeing in this picture is the fusion of the idea of professor and researcher. That in the early days, corresponding to the age of the college that I spoke about, when teaching and service, preparing people to go out into the world, when those were the paramount values, professor and researcher was at a low percentage. But in the age of the research university, at a time particularly when government money was funding more and more research within academia, the identities of researcher and professor fused together, and that is where we are today. So academia is a place where change is slow because there is a stubborn resistance, because after all, we don't necessarily expect higher education to be buffeted about by the winds of every change. But what we're talking about here is a transformation in our culture that has taken hold and which was financed lavishly. If it's going to change, it's going to be hard to change. And so I wrote this book because I wanted to bring us back to an awareness of where we came from and the importance of teaching in our culture. After I finished the book, I showed it to one of my trusted readers, and he told me, he said, you know, there's really 3 books in this book. And the first book is something I've been talking to you about. It's about a call to reform, that we can't accept what we're doing. We have to overhaul the curriculum to prepare students for the reality that they actually face. But if that were all it was, somebody who doesn't want to disagree with me, who doesn't want to agree with me, I should say, somebody who doesn't want to agree would read 10 pages and throw the book across the room, because you don't need to be lectured at by somebody when you can be doing something else, especially if you're secure in your own point of view. So the second book within the book is something else that I've been showing you a little bit about, a little bit of. That is the conviction that I began with, which is that if you want to change something, you got to know how it got there in the first place. And I've been talking to you a little bit about that during this brief time today, and we can talk about it more during the question and answer. But also, there's the idea that if I'm trying to tell people to do things differently, and obviously that's what I'm doing, then if I throw in some good stories of how we got to where we are, then maybe people will stay with it and they'll read to the end, and maybe we'll get a chance to have a conversation about how things can change. Now, but the third book within the book deals with a value that not only is cherished by academics, but it's also cherished by, it's something that if it's not cherished by, at least everyone in the general public is aware of, namely academic freedom. If you can ask any professor, any member of the academic community about academic freedom, and he or she will have an opinion. Because in the United States, academic freedom is a cherished value, and everybody who's committed themselves to academia has some understanding of what academic freedom means to them. The story that I told a minute ago about tenured professors losing their jobs during the McCarthy witch hunt, part of the reason that was such a scandalous time is because of the violations of academic freedom that it entailed. But we are very attached to academic freedom, we in the professoriate, but it seems to me that there isn't a freedom worth having that didn't come with a responsibility. And academic responsibility is something we hear about a little bit less. And so the third book within the book is, and I think that this is something that I hope you've been able to infer from these brief remarks, the third book within the book is a call to academic responsibility, that we have to be able to take seriously and our caretaking responsibility to our students, that we're not just in the knowledge creation business, we who teach in universities, we who train graduate students to be PhDs. We're also in the student creation business. That's where we started, that's where we remain. And if we don't take responsibility for our students, we don't deserve to have a good relationship with the general public who funds us. And so that's where we need to go. There are a lot of committed teachers in academia, but we need to commit the institution to a curriculum that is sustainable on the human level for our graduate students. And on that note, I will leave you to question and answer. I will answer questions until the last dog dies.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. Yes, please wait for the microphone. It's coming right at you.
You said we could teach an introductory class to students who were not going to go into that field and make it valuable to them. And I certainly agree with that, because we can teach ways of thinking, the kind of knowledge that's produced, the kinds of tests for that knowledge. But it seems harder for a graduate class, because graduate classes seem much more information intensive. Can you comment on that?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. It is harder because not only are graduate classes information intensive in ways that professors and students both believe to be important, but the students themselves have been socialized to start with into a belief that this is professor school. But it isn't necessarily. Graduate school prepares people to be professors, yes, but not just that. But a lot of the ways that we can do things differently, we can start with thinking about what the demands of the different kinds of jobs outside of academia are. And employers who are outside of academia, as I said, the ones who look closely, they respect very much the skills that PhDs bring to market. But if you ask them what it is that they would most like the skills PhDs to have that they don't currently have, one of those skills is collaboration. Because especially in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, those classes are built on the model of the solitary genius laboring in the garret until he or she produces a manuscript of brilliance that is then carried to the publisher and converted into a book with no change whatsoever. Now that's a myth, of course, and all of us who write know that the reality is quite a bit different. But the fact is that the tasks that we ask students to perform in graduate seminars are highly individualistic in nature. And one of the ways that we can prepare students to compete in workplaces outside of academia without necessarily sacrificing everything about the content that we believe to be important is to think about those tasks, at least some of them, in more collaborative terms than we do, especially since technology allows for collaboration in ways that it never did before. So it's possible to design the classroom more collaboratively, or to design writing assignments that students can collaborate on. For example, an annotated bibliography that takes the scope of a subfield that students work on together. I'm just throwing out a couple of ideas, but a lot of this will vary from field to field. But the ethos that I think that we can bring to the work we do that is different is to think about it from the student's point of view. What do our students need? Well, now I've traveled quite a bit around the country in support of the ideas that I've talked to you about today, and I've talked to a lot of graduate students, and graduate students are almost unanimous in what it is that they want from graduate school that they're not getting. What they want is coherence. They want some kind of coherent relation between what they learn in school and what they're going to need to know when they get out of school, which is, when you think about it, neither a particularly extravagant demand nor a particularly illogical one. That is, we ought to be able to expect it. Only in graduate school would we look at those would we look at proposals like that and say, boy, that's hard. It's in every other kind of school, like law school, medical school, all of those curricula are designed with the end use in mind. They're professional schools. Well, graduate school is professional school too. It's just that the professions that we prepare our students for are more varied than we've long assumed. That one generation where everybody got a job, that one generation blotted out the historical sun. before that Cold War generation, PhDs did all kinds of work. After that Cold War generation, when the job market, when the academic job market contracted, PhDs did all kinds of work. We need to, as teachers, think about our graduate education as student-centered. That is, let's think about it from the student's point of view and work from there.
Yes, got a question. Here comes the microphone.
What do you see as the role of accrediting agencies in the responsibility for this problem, or whether they seem to be helping graduate programs to be more responsive to student needs?
Well, the first thing that I'm going to say in response to this is that I am familiar with the work of accrediting agencies only in a glancing way. That is, I've done some work evaluating graduate programs and undergraduate programs here and there, which is something that some professors get to do in the course of their careers. But the actual work of the agency, the behind closed doors government work, I do not claim an expertise. But I think that there's a way in which, if we depend on the government and the government's understanding of what graduate school is to set the standards for what we ought to be doing, it's like asking for your gardener to perform surgery on you, because your gardener has a spade and a rake. But really what you may need is the instruments like scalpel that can allow you to aim more directly at the problem. So as knowledgeable as your gardener might be about what's wrong with you, your gardener doesn't necessarily have the tools, or to put it in a different, to change the metaphor, the government is at a sufficient remove from what goes on the ground in graduate programs, that the kind of granular change, perhaps of the sort that I spoke of a moment ago in that hypothetical introduction to sociology course, where collaborative writing assignments might be one way to introduce students to introduce coherence to the student education. There's no way to write government regulation or accreditation regulation that's going to address that, to make those kinds of subtle changes. So perhaps I'm simply being suspicious because I don't know enough about what accreditors do. So I'm perfectly happy to admit to limited knowledge, if not ignorance. But my belief is that we have to get our own house in order. That we in the professoriate, we do a lot of good and even noble work. And I think most of us are committed to something bigger than ourselves, and I mean that in a really good way. But we need to look a little more closely at the history and the structure of what it is that we do for our students, and think about it as something that we do for students, not simply for the pursuit of truth, but also for the people who pass through our doors.
Yes, sir. Alex got a question back here in the back.
Hello, I wanted to thank you first for coming out. I work here at the Clinton School. It's great to have you here, and it's great to hear your talk tonight.
Likewise.
Question for you, ask you to play, I guess, a future teller, I guess, if you will, to share your thoughts on what the future of higher education may look like 20, 30 years down the line. I ask that in the context of the very rapid increase of accessibility of knowledge and of information, be it through videos, through just information on your phones, information online, through different learning academies, different, very great accessibility of knowledge, greater accessibility of knowledge maybe than we've ever had in the history of time right now. And a sense that we can look at data today of undergraduate enrollment nationally is on a decline right now. Graduate enrollment nationally, certainly in very specific areas of graduate studies, are on a steep decline right now. And some of that is job and the economy and the turnaround there, but some of it is a sense of I can acquire very specific information toward a specific craft or a specific industry, and I can do that outside of the traditional classroom. So to the degree that you could speak to that, 20, 30 years from now, where do you see this headed? Do you see that turning? Do you see that accelerating?
Well, there's an awful lot to your question, so let me try to divide it up into some information McNuggets that I can serve up to you. The first thing, to return to my talk, the slide that the president of Chicago talking about the work of investigation is primary in the research university, and I said that investigation is the synonym for research. Well, that it certainly was that, and I do not in any way retract my statement, but the term that was being refracted from the German model, that is, the term that investigation was replacing, is a German word that has no translation. That word is Wissenschaft. It has no exact translation because it has many, many connotations. But one of the connotations that it possesses that the word investigation does not possess, that is a willful mistranslation on Harper, the Chicago president's part. The connotation that's missing from investigation that is in Wissenschaft is contemplative, reflective. And I bring this up because in the world of what we recognize, what we call data analytics or assessment, which is a set of values and practices that are already making a very deep mark not only on academia but on other areas in society, other information-driven areas of society. Data analytics, the ability through digital technology to bring enormous rafts of information to bear faster than we can ever hope to deal with them. I was talking to a scientist the other day, and he said that what scientists really need to worry about, the scientists can benefit greatly and have benefited greatly from the advances that computing power can bring to the work that they do. But computing power generates so much data that this man, who was a scientist himself, is saying that the temptation is to continue to generate it and never to reflect upon it. And I say this not only as a humanist, but simply as a concerned member of society, that I think that we could all benefit from from reflection on what it is that we are learning how to do, because the reflection itself is part of the learning process. I'm a poor futurist, I believe, but I think that you don't have to be a great futurist to say that data analytics has a very bright future in both academia and society at large, that we're going to be doing more of this, not less. Are we going to be able to preserve the ability to reflect, to analyze what it is that we're doing at the same time? That I'm not so sure of, and I'm a little worried about as well. Your question also had to do with demographics, and the decline in college enrollment in part has to do with the decline of 18-year-olds. But the transformation of the demographic of college enrollment, you have more and more people who are what we call non-traditional students, people who are going to college not at the so-called traditional age of 18, but who are going later in life. Our ability to adapt is going to depend in part on our ability to take into account these changes and to do student-centered work, to design the work we do in terms of not only the content, but also the needs of the students. But when we think about the needs of those students, something that I think we really need to be conscious of, it's when we talk about the price of college or the price of higher education, everyone knows the price of higher education, it far outpaces inflation. It's a common story. I have two things to say about it. First of all, the major driver behind the increased cost of higher education is the withdrawal of government support for higher education. Yes, there are other things that go into it. The rising cost of administration, for example. And we shouldn't say that those things don't matter, but the economic analysis tells us that The biggest single factor is the government's the withdrawal of government support, both federal and local. And this applies to private universities as well as public, because the partnership between the government and higher education is not simply with public universities, and never has been. So this is more than an economic issue, because at one time, in fact, especially during that golden age of abundance, that Cold War generation that I was talking to you about, the increased investment in higher education by the government represented a commitment by the government to the ideal, and the government, by the way, is us, a commitment to the idea that higher education is a public good. Or as Thomas Jefferson put it, an educated public, he was talking about higher education, is if you put more higher education into the population, you're benefiting the population. Jefferson was not talking about economics. He said that, for example, that a more educated populace is better able to defend their freedom. So he's talking, and on a practical level, that means that the more higher education in a population, the better the choices people will make in running their democracy. But there's a bottom line value to this as well, that the immense investment in higher education during the post-war era proved out the idea that if you educate the population as a whole benefits, because the country becomes much wealthier as a result of these increased skills. The United States became colossally wealthy, and during the period that corresponds to the investment level rising and the commitment to higher education as a public good. Now, beginning in the 1980s, as the withdrawal of support from higher education began and continued, you had more than an economic shift. We witnessed a shift from higher education being a public good to higher education being an individual investment. So these days, people talk about ROI, return on investment. Is college a good investment? Well, mercifully, it still is. Otherwise, I'd be out on the street with my hat in my hand. But it's really incontrovertible that the numbers show that people who get a college degree have much greater career earnings than people who don't get one, and that helps to drive the increased investment in higher education right now, because people think of it as something that's good for them. But that's not really civic engagement. That's a decision that's being driven by free agency and a kind of rational economic choice. It's not the worst reason to make a decision. But if what we're talking about is something that we ought to be looking at as good for the whole, good for the democracy, looking at higher education in terms of ROI is not going to get us to where we need to be as a collective, as a society. And for that reason, I'd like to look with optimism at President Obama's recent call to make community college free and accessible to everybody, not because it's going to become policy. I think anybody who's even remotely aware of the political scene in the United States knows that that's a non-starter as long as the current political climate prevails. But rather, what you're seeing is a sitting president, for the first time in more than 2 generations, making a call for higher education to be something that we take public ownership of as something that is for all of us. And if that conversation can begin, though it has begun, if that conversation can sustain itself, and if it can go somewhere, and if we can get to where we start thinking as a group about the value of education, then I will be even more optimistic, cautiously optimistic, than I dare to be. I need to be optimistic. As I said, this is my job. But But I think we all should be, because otherwise we're never going to get to where we need to be.
Yes, sir. Question right back here.
Could you talk about your vision for postdoctoral programs and the constellation of institutes and centers of research in this country?
Certainly. So postdoctoral programs arose in the sciences, or postdoctoral fellowships arose in the sciences beginning in approximately the 1970s. And they coincided with the contraction of the academic job market. So you had PhD scientists who suddenly, after a generation of abundance, suddenly couldn't get a job as a professor and the leaders of their own labs. And so what were you going to do with them? Because scientists need to keep doing science in order to stay relevant. And so the grant money that was around started being apportioned to create salaried positions within science labs for people holding doctorates to get a chance to keep trying the academic job market until they could hook on. Well, the job market is contracted in the sciences and also other fields even further. And the result is that the postdoctoral position has become, for a deplorably large number of people, a career path rather than a holding pattern. It wasn't so good that it was a holding tank to start with, because the understanding was that only a certain number of people were going to emerge from that holding tank. But the idea that that postdoctoral work becomes in effect an entire career for people, a career of insecurity, of frustrated hope, it's a sign of the kind of denial that I've been speaking of, that the scientific establishment is willing to tolerate that. But in fact, the bench sciences, or the lab sciences as they're also called, their economy is in big trouble. And this always comes as a surprise to people on the humanities side, because humanists see all of the money that goes into into academic science, and they think, how could there be any problem there? Yeah, anybody who starts up a lab in a university is getting $1 million from that university just to start the lab. So where's the trouble? But even though there are large amounts of money that are being spent, the academic job market and also the industry job market in the bench sciences is becoming glutted. And yet, the system in the hard sciences is very hard to shrink, because unlike in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, where the basic unit is the student, the basic unit in the bench sciences is the laboratory. The lab exists in order to produce publications. In order to produce publications, the lab needs grants. So the publications are used as the basis to apply for more grants, which produce more publications, which produce more grants, and on goes the hamster wheel. But in order for that to work, the lab needs a consistent supply of human capital, of labor. The labor comes from graduate students and postdocs. And so it's very difficult for science to shrink the large scale that it exists on, because it's an industrial scale that is designed to produce this cycle of publications and grants. But grant money is ever more competitive, and the academic job market is becoming ever more straitened. The sciences are entering into a kind of crisis that will be very hard for them to address without changing the structure of what they do in ways that that scientists have not yet shown any public willingness to consider.
Lynn, one question before we leave. So colleges and universities get measured a lot on like 4-year graduation rates and 6-year graduation rates at the undergraduate level. What kind, as you've traveled around the country with this book and talking to people in education, what's the pushback on the 1 in 4 PhD program, and do you see a concern about the public? Is that above their head Is that going to be a political issue? Is it going to be an issue for people that debate in the future? Right now, I see statistics on what's your 4-year graduation rate and what's your 6-year graduation rate, but no one says how many PhDs that X dropped out of the program or didn't get jobs. Where's that going?
So undergraduate education is, and I think will continue to be, and rightfully so, at the center of a lot of the public debate over what higher education should look like in this country. So that's fine, because you have a lot more people who are going to college than who are going to graduate school in the arts and sciences. But in the need for reform in of graduate school in the arts and sciences, I think that the general public is understandably underinformed, because graduate school in the arts and sciences usually comes into the news only in order to tell some extravagant story of an unemployed PhD who's doing something weird, like take your PhD in sociology and look, he's working to feed the crocodiles in the zoo or something like that, to avoid becoming food for the crocodiles himself. I think that the debate that is starting now and that is going on, the conversation I've had with you today is a conversation that, from the point of view of the way that graduate school works and the numbers, the employment rate of PhDs in the professoriate, we could be having the same conversation 25 years ago. But 25 years ago, nobody wanted to have that conversation, because there was a collective hope that the good old days from the Cold War would come back again, that we would return to normal when everybody could get a job. But now there's a little bit more perspective. There's a realization that one generation when everybody could get a job, that was the anomaly. The normal is actually when people get all kinds of jobs. We're having these conversations now, and that, to me, is a cause for optimism, because we're willing to have these conversations now, even if there's disagreement. But I've gotten a chance to travel around the country and talk to a lot of academic audiences on American academic earth, because people are willing now to have these fundamental conversations about how we can change what we do and what might it look like when we do. And in an institution that is historically so suspicious of change, the fact that those conversations are happening now, I think that we can take some heart in them, as long as we don't get complacent and assume that the conversations themselves will substitute from the difficult and necessary work that we need to do.
And we thank you for having that conversation tonight at the Clinton School. Len Cassuto's book, The Graduate School Mess, you can purchase and visit with him right now. So, Len, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Thank you for coming.